Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to this podcast. And as it happens, we've had a really good chat for the last 10 minutes or so prior to even kicking this off, which has been a fantastic sort of catch up, get together. We know each other through, I suppose, different lenses. I mean,
Yeah.
through the Commonwealth Games, through sport in general. You are still competing and still competing at an amazingly high level. I've long since retired, and we'll definitely pick up on that. And I get involved in projects and change, and it's why I set up the Adapting to Change podcast, just to talk about the generality of things. And again, you're not just a sport coach, but you're a business coach. You very often work with boards, and you talk about governance. And you've now relocated. Post-COVID, you relocated to Wales. So you're a man who's all about change, about growth, about supporting and coaching. And it was my privilege that you were my first ever speaker when I ran a TEDx. And at that, you talked about leadership. And it really resonated with me because I fear sometimes leadership is about fame, wealth, money, power, etc. And your approach was much more about humble leadership,
Yes.
supporting the team, and that really resonated with me. And that is 10 years ago.
I
And I'm
know.
wondering how the world has changed in that 10 years, how your views may have changed over that time, what your experience has been. Um, let's perhaps start with your sporting background. Okay. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, Tim. This is a great opportunity to catch up. And I think, as I said, apologies for my throat. I've got this 100-day cough. I'm on about, I don't know, day 50 or something. So hopefully it's not another 50, but we'll see how we do. Yeah, my sporting background, it is a good place to start because I think it frames quite a lot of who I am and my identity. My dad was a PE teacher, and a decent rugby player on the wing, and my mum was a good swimmer. So I guess sport was always part of my identity growing up. And I grew up in Jersey. My dad introduced short tennis to Jersey when I was about 8, which was when people start playing it. So I was lucky. If you read if you read some of these books about 10,000 hours and the kind of talent stuff, it's a lot about actually people being in the right place at the right time. So my dad had the keys to the St John's indoor sports centre, and I was able to play in there and play short tennis. So yeah, I just got into it very young, loved all sports. So I believe very much in the concept of range, and I've got 3 young kids now, and getting a range of different things is important. I know you spoke to say John Scriven about that type of idea on the podcast before. And then, yeah, I was always combining sport with study because both my parents were teachers. So this kind of whole student athlete identity was key for me. I went to university. Some of my kind of peer tennis players all went full time when they were 16 or 18, but I always did O-levels and university. I did play full time a bit for when I was 21, when I graduated from university, and I made the qualifying of Wimbledon, so I was in it, but I think like 15 rounds back. So yeah, you wouldn't have seen me on TV then. And then I actually then kind of fell into coaching and became the head coach at Loughborough University in the Midlands, which is a decent sporting university, and then decided, well, actually, I really want to be the athlete again. So I became the student athlete again and did a master's in sports science, doctorate in sports psychology, and ended up playing through the university system, which was fantastic. Just kind of milked the university system, and what a fantastic place that I was able to play in, with indoor courts and players and free balls and massage and all the sports science stuff, which was wonderful. So yeah, I was in Great Britain universities teams and got to tour the world. So for me, I'm a huge believer in sport as a way of learning life skills and the opportunities that it's brought me. I think too many people think, oh, I'll get into that sport, and if you want to be elite, you have only succeeded if you're in the top 100 or whatever. But I think it's just given me so many opportunities, and ultimately it's given me the opportunity to speak to you, because we met through my career as a sports psychologist, through supporting the Jersey Commonwealth Games team a few times. So we met in, well, what was it, in Melbourne, I think, for the first time in
Melbourne
2000.
was the first one, and then
Yeah.
Glasgow in 2014.
Yeah.
Melbourne, me being going around with my arm in a car.
Yeah. It was, Willie won't he be able to compete with this cast on and bash people on the head when he's swimming the first leg of the triathlon. So all of that was great, and I'm still going. So yeah, I'm relocated to Wales, but I'm just about to captain the Welsh over 45s team in the Four Nations, which is just wonderful. And I've just won the Great Britain over 45s men's tennis singles. So it's, I guess I'm a big believer in just keep going, just keep going. And sport's not necessarily about winning. Obviously, you try and compete as hard as you can. I love competition, but it's about everything else that it can bring you, health and community and all of that stuff. So there's an initial potted history.
I think it's really interesting, and I'm interested in your view. I have some of my own experience in this area. We often use sport metaphors for business, and I think in some respects they work quite well, in terms of discipline and goals and structure and roles. But I think in other areas they work less well. I've had the privilege of working with rowing teams where you're looking for 100% commitment to one particular goal, and that's normally within a reasonable time horizon such that it can sacrifice everything for that goal. Business tends to be a bit more complex than that. You don't have one goal. You don't necessarily get away being that selfish. What's your experience the difference between a sports coach and the metaphors and tools that work from that, and a business coach, and what realistically works? What can you take from one to the other, and what doesn't work?
Yeah, I mean, it does work sometimes and it doesn't in others. I used to work for a company we've spoken about called Lane 4. The managing director was Adrian Morehouse, who won a gold medal in Lane 4. So the proposition was, how do you bring the inspiring stories of sport and the rigor of sports psychology into business and leadership and management. So that was part of my kind of business apprenticeship working for them. And sometimes the sports metaphor didn't go down well. So there's this concept of mental toughness. And we found it didn't necessarily go down well in an NHS context, for example. It did go down very well in a retail context, very numbers driven, outcome focused environment. So I think it probably depends on your audience. It probably depends on sector, and how driving that sector is possibly. And I think that word toughness has been changed over the years, and the word resilience is now used, and that's probably a better all-encompassing word, because it has some more of the kind of mental health connotations, which is entirely appropriate, I think. But I would also say that the best sports people, from a longevity point of view, probably aren't those that are ultimately selfish. So my doctorate research was on student athletes, and lots of that work came out of work-life balance literature, which became very relevant during COVID, interestingly enough. But I think one thought would be that those people that are able to sustainably balance a performance are those that are able to also balance relationships and the other stuff that's going on in your life, and that's true in work and in business. You get these heroic CEOs who only work and screw up their family lives and often screw up everyone else's lives, and they kind of probably have a book and they probably look great, but they crash and burn at some point, and it doesn't create resilient organizations. So I think there's a good argument to be had, but ultimately I would say that sport is just a metaphor, and also a theatre of life, isn't it? It's just another environment to perform in. So some of the best examples of good performance could be true in sport and in life.
And I'm really interested in that word performance because you're a psychologist, and when we perform in sport or perform at work, we start then thinking about roles and responsibilities. But if we unpick that a little bit, we can start talking about egos and personas, and that performance, how genuine and authentic that feels, or how much we are fulfilling a role, an obligation, an expectation. And in recent years, we have surfaced a crisis in terms of anxiety and depression, and perhaps a feeling of imposter syndrome. Now, whether that is new or it was always there and we are now more alive to it, I think this whole thing about performance and persona and ego and identity is quite interesting. And you touched upon it in your TED talk about heroic leadership, and you've touched upon it there again, where you use that word about performance.
Yeah, and I think it all depends on what you mean by performance. I've sat with business groups who use that word, and I mean, it's kind of my role as a psychologist to ask questions, annoying questions, and it's kind of what do you mean by performance? Because there's an assumption that everyone in their business should be performing at a high level all the time, and that's just not doable usually. When as an athlete, it's all about peak performance. You can't. I mean, you might want to, but you want to perform at your best when you most need to. And often in organizational context, there isn't a thing that you're working up to. It's just kind of business as usual. So I think there's a big thing about defining what performance means. You touched up there on the bit about performance being, more of a mask, I suppose, and putting on a performance. Maybe there's a bit of that in there as well. And I think there's a whole literature that I'm sure you're very aware of around being authentic and authentic leadership. And I think the nicest description I've heard in that literature is that an authentic leader is someone that's able to be themselves more with skill. And I guess, with social media and all that kind of stuff, there's lots of comparisons and putting on a mask of performance there. And I think if you're able to just be yourself in any environment, whatever that means, warts and all, that's okay. And I think people really warm to that. I think people quite like a bit of vulnerability in their coaches and their leaders, because that then allows them to not feel like they have to be perfect the whole time. In fact, one of the best leaders I worked with, I was running a coaching accreditation course, and I had this wonderful lady who was voted the best manager in the NHS 2 years running. She was on my course. And I was like, you should probably be running this. And I was saying, well, what was it that you did? What were you doing? What do you do with your teams? Give us some ideas. And she obviously shared a lot of things, but one of them was that in the first meeting that she had with people in her teams, like in a kind of induction meeting, she'd basically tell them all the times that she'd screwed up, and what she'd learned from that. And that kind of made it okay for people to then come to her and say, look, I've really screwed up. So she was, she wasn't a perfect performer, but she was authentic in her performance, maybe. So I think that's quite healthy.
I want to be a bit challenging around this, and I know you're good for that. I'm curious about the vulnerability in the authenticity. I think we live in a world where we've got to be pretty selective, I suggest. And I personally would be quite protective of being vulnerable because, we live in a world that's quite polarized. We seem to have lost the center ground, and people believe passionately about A or Z. There are not many people that do nuance these days. And I think if you're vulnerable, you will very quickly find yourself categorized, classified, cancelled, etc. You've got to be really careful what you choose to share with people in an environment where context is often ignored or not seen when something hits the newspapers. And in terms of authenticity, I think one of the challenges of authenticity, if authentically you are grumpy, or if authentically you're feeling really down, actually bringing your authentic self to work maybe ain't the right thing to do. Maybe, okay, you have a duty to try and pull yourself together for the rest of the troops. Now, then you start looking at things like toxic positivity. Okay, when that goes too far and you've got this mask and you're pretending everything is fine, I'm fine, when of course you're not. And so very quickly we enter this minefield of, what is socially or corporately acceptable behavior if you're in terms of your emotions. And I was listening to something the other day that said, there was a time when we were told to bring our whole self to work. And then, of course, people discovered what their whole selves looked like and they said, for God's sake, don't bring your whole self to work. Just bring the work aspect of you to work. The rest, please leave at home. So that's a long, rambling introduction, but I'm trying to just get across the complexity, the messiness. I don't think it's that clear.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think it's messy, and a good forum for this, for me to explore this myself, is in parenting. And my wife and I talk about this all the time. So I have a 11-year-old, 10-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And yeah, so I think we're both very aware, as a psychologist, I'm very aware of, motivation theory and all this kind of stuff, which says that, to be most motivated in things and to explore things, people need to be self-determined, and they need to choose things themselves and have the freedom and autonomy to do that. And so how much rope do you give kids to try stuff out? And I think we try and do that as much as possible. We're going on a family gap year, by the way, from the end of this school year. So that's an example of trying stuff out, but I think it has to be within boundaries. Funny enough, I was listening to a great podcast about this a couple of weeks ago, where a child psychologist was basically saying the same thing. How to parent. It's about having very clear boundaries, but also having empathy when someone is struggling with those boundaries. And it's not like you have to commit to those boundaries all the time, and it's not like you have to fully listen and empathize and go, okay, well then on this and every occasion I won't hold that boundary because you disagree. I think it's just case by case, isn't it? It's just life. So I think, in a work context, it's about appreciating that people can't be performing well all the time. They've got stuff going on for them, but then you've still got some boundaries. You've still got duties, director duties, or role duties, and there's that side of it as well. So it's probably a sliding scale rather than either or.
And it reminds me of something. And again, this is your specialist area rather than mine, but examining two relationships in terms of transactional analysis. And Fred may talk to Mary 20 times a day, and they'll have a lot of banter and they'll have a lot of chat. And one day, Fred was a bit of a rush and said, Mary, just do this, would you? But of course, through the transactional analysis, he's accumulated a huge amount of credit that allows him on this one occasion to say, Mary, could you do this? John observes this and then just says to Mary, do this. And get short shrift back, and quite rightly so. And I think, it is about sometimes relationship. And I think understanding that idea of human connection as part of the process, I think is vitally important. And we may analyze this in terms of transactional analysis, or we may just say it's about relationship, and it's about how those boundaries may be different for those different people in those different circumstances. And of course, leadership changes according to circumstances. We don't necessarily take a coaching style. When the building's burning down, we probably want a little bit more command and control.
Totally. Yeah, I remember I was doing a one-to-one with some managers from Microsoft, probably 10 years ago now. But we had a couple of calls. I think it was over Skype at the time, and I had this guy in America, and it was around when they were doing performance management conversations, and they were quite harsh conversations. And we were brought in to kind of support how they had those conversations to improve teams. And I remember this American guy talking about his team and basically lining up, people in terms of their performance. And it was like, what to do with all these poor performers. And I remember having a conversation with him, and to your point about relationships, and he thought his job was to get them to be better because they weren't doing any good. So it's kind of devolving the problem to the people over there without realizing it was necessarily to do with the interaction with him. And I said to him, okay, well, line up the people in your team, 10 people or whatever, in order of their performance. So he wrote this down in this piece of paper. And I said, okay, well now next to that, line up the people in order of the quality of your relationship with them out of 10, I think it was. And what do you notice? And he's like, well, not surprisingly, it was exactly lined up. So it's okay. So maybe this is about the quality of your relationship and the quality of those conversations rather than their performance. So how can you build rather than how can you fire that person ultimately, or how can you force them to perform better? How can you build a relationship with them such that their performance naturally improves as a side product of that? And and I guess there's that big question: to what extent are you creating someone's underperformance as a manager, as a leader? And I don't think people think about that enough. They don't think of it relationally, rather than it's a performance owned by someone else.
I think that's a really interesting area to explore further, because we are increasingly seeing systems, robotics, technology, and now, of course, AI provide us waves of data. And in some niche areas, we've been looking at biometric data, even in terms of financial services. In my youth, I worked in some financial services, and we used to go to the pub and drink, 3 pints of cider at lunchtime and then go back to work. Nowadays, they biometrically assess you before you do investment dealing in certain firms. And, all the athletes with whom I work provide me their Garmin data, and so that we can enhance their performance. And this combination of systems and data and technology and AI arguably is bypassing that relationship in terms of how we monitor and evaluate. How do you see that? How do you see the future of performance management given the changes that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think data is just the first, or not the first, but one step in improvement and performance, isn't it? So I've got my Aura ring on here. So yeah, I love a bit of data, and my Garmin actually. So yeah, I'm a big fan of monitoring stuff, but it doesn't mean just because you're monitoring it that it's going to improve. What we know from psychology is that if you get feedback, just for getting the feedback and the awareness of something, then that may create some shift. So the concept of awareness being curative, I think, is important. But it's not everything. So I mean, I do all kinds of different bits of work. And one of my pieces of work at the moment, I was in London yesterday doing some really interesting work with witnesses to improve their performance. So there's another forum, a very specific performance with different rules. And we get some data before we have these sessions with them. And the data that I get is about kind of psychological aspects of how they're feeling and their emotions and what their personality is like. But I always see that, some kind of 360 type behavior data as a springboard to a conversation. So I think that's always going to be true of coaches. It's a big debate going on in tennis, for example. There's more data. Tennis is not as good as other sports historically at using data. Not as good as say a triathlon possibly, or those types of sports. And there's more data coming in, but it's how do you as a coach get all this stuff find something that's useful to turn it into, insight, and then you've got, well, what does that performer that you're working with, what do they need? Are they ready to hear anything? When are you going to give this? How are you going to give this? So there's all those questions about how you communicate that, because if the athlete's not interested, then it's kind of pointless, isn't it? So yeah, it's just one part. It will always be one part, and the human element is always going to be there, and probably increasingly more important.
But it's interesting in business. I suspect the human element will be less there, whether we like it or not, with remote working, with remote teams, with the gig economy, with contractors, with 0 hours contracts and the like. That human to human relationship, I think, is perhaps weaker. I think our loyalty to our employers in the 1950s is very different to the loyalty to our employers' profession, ethics, values in the next 50 years. I think all of those relationships are actually quite different.
Yeah.
Some maybe regard them as better or worse or weaker, but I think they're definitely different.
Yeah, there's this whole thing around the psychological contract that we have and how that's changing to organizations. And yeah, I completely agree. I think it's changing and it's different. And lots of jobs, lots of jobs won't be there because of AI or whatever, but there will still be the human element, I think. So there will always be, it's just those types of jobs will become more important, and we just need to get better at those. And we're humans, we want connection. We're just going to find it somewhere else. So it might not be in our day-to-day interactions in a workplace in a standard way, but you got to find it some other way somehow.
Yeah, and I recognize that
It's
in
change. Yeah.
how people may be passionate about their football club or their sport, or their hobby, music, pottery, art. And it's quite interesting, those people who become passionate about those things and yet don't necessarily feel engaged at work, or indeed those that are absolutely passionate about their work, almost blindly. The post office scandal is unfolding in front of our TVs every night. And this idea of protecting the brand, which seems to be a mantra that comes out quite a lot, is this passionate allegiance to some sort of nebulous concept of the post office that appears to have led to some very dysfunctional behavior.
Yeah, so from my witness training, I was supposed to wait for a specific question, but I'll dive in. Yeah, how would I respond? I think, I think we're moving into the concepts of culture, governance, leadership, identity, all those types of buzzwords in relation to the post office. I think one broad thing to say is that governance in general, and we've talked about this a bit before, governance in general is gaining in appreciation as a thing, and as something that's not just kind of a dull, got to tick some boxes, but it's it's vital for organizations to function well and not explode as many have done. And my take on governance more broadly is that governance historically has focused on more the compliance aspects, which looking good on paper, getting things that are maybe technically right, and the people that have done that kind of work have probably come from more an accounting or a legal, finance backgrounds. And I would say this because I'm a chartered psychologist, but they haven't focused on the behavioral aspects of governance. And I think there's an increasing awareness that those behavioral aspects of governance are vital, and sometimes the thing that can make the difference between whether something can work or not. So I think compliance is absolutely necessary, but is it the whole story? No, I don't think it is. So some of my work, which is kind of labeled Boardroom Dynamics, which talks about the interactions, the relationships between people within a boardroom context in the room, but beyond the room, and how that interacts with shifting the culture within an organization, and how that culture then reflects back on the board itself. I think my broad point is those things need to be considered in the round a bit more, and I think there's increasing awareness of that.
I'll see if I can make this one more into a question rather than a mind dump.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I think the whole thing about compliance is really interesting. I mean, let's unpack this very briefly, and then I'll try and turn it into a question.
Sure.
In some respects, when we look at culture, we want to have the right culture. Therefore, we want people to fit in and share our vision, our values, our drives, etc. In other respects, we sit there and go, actually, no, a little bit of dissent, a bit of diversity, a bit of innovation, some different perspectives is really good. And it's very difficult to run down both those tram lines at the same time, to turn around and say, we really need people that fit in, and we really need people that speak out. I mean, how do you do that in terms of even boardroom dynamics?
You're absolutely spot on. So through some of the research I did at Henley Business School, starting in 2010, which led to some of my work in governance and then writing on this, I've created what's called the 11 C's model of governance. And essentially it's a 2x2 matrix, which on one axis, on the y-axis is technical, and then behavioral, similar to what I've just described about the kind of the shift and the recognition in more in the behavioral side. And then on the other axis is individual, and then team or board. And in the behavioral and team box, there are 3 C's. One is culture. So that's more the kind of social group, organizational angle on this. But the other 2 are about cohesion and challenge. And it's exactly what you said. You need a balance of those 2. You need both. If you have too much cohesion, you get this kind of fluffiness and everyone agreeing with each other, and that's no good. But if you have only challenge, then it's not a nice place to be, and you get burnout. So you need both those. However, to your point, how do you do it? I think you start with the cohesion. You start with the support side, and you have to start with things like what's been titled psychological safety in teams. And what that means is that people feel safe to share stuff, share that they are not happy with things, or that that they've screwed up, or they're not sure on stuff. So how do you do that? Well, then the leader has to role model it, a bit like my NHS leader. So a lot of it then starts with leadership behaviors around role modeling supportive behaviors, and role modeling that it's okay for other people to voice stuff. So one really specific thing that I do in pretty much all of my work with teams or individuals, well, teams in this example, is do a check-in, which is really simple, which is just go around the room and get someone to say something. And usually it's a bit more specific than that. It's usually, if it's a learning environment, it might be to share something that they're passionate about, to your point about passions outside of work, something proud of in work and passionate outside of work. And that begins with everyone saying something, so they're more likely to voice later. So you don't get the power dynamics as much. It also gives you a sense of the whole person, not just the person in work. You get outside of work as well, so they're human. And thirdly, it's usually quite positive. And what we know about conversations is that if you start them in a true and positive way, that usually then has a great impact on the quality of the conversation. So there's a lot going on in doing a check-in like that, which can have a big impact. And a lot of this research on check-ins, you might have heard of some of the stuff from the Checklist Manifesto from a guy called Atul Gawande, and is a big thing in aviation. It's been stolen by the medical profession. They found that if you do that kind of thing before operations, it reduces the likelihood of deaths and complications by 35%. So it's kind of really important stuff, and very simple to do and very basic.
Well, I think it's a really good point to draw on, because if we look at pre-flight checks, for example, these pre-flight checks are done by a pilot who is actually familiar of what they're supposed to do, and the checks are an aide-memoire to make sure that they've done it. These pre-flight checks were never intended as a novice guide to fly a plane.
No.
I think there's a danger, or I wonder to what extent now the availability of checklists everywhere instead of training and a deep understanding actually puts the organization more at risk, rather than actually mitigating risk by having these reminders for people who are competent, capable, having the capacity, drive, and desire to do the things that are necessary.
Yeah. Well, I guess my point about checklists is probably more, I mean, it's kind of a nice distinction. I never thought of it as a checklist versus a check-in. And the check-in is you're doing that not necessarily around a specific checklist, but the function of it is that it builds the social cohesion so the group can work better, regardless of the technical aspect of the check-in. Yeah, but I guess your point is about checklists. If you fulfill the checklist, then you're done. And that comes from data, doesn't it? It comes from like AI. Well, like, if you do these things, then you'll be okay, but it doesn't account for why people are doing those things underneath it.
I think the why is a really interesting one, isn't it? I think I have different views on this, so I could potentially disagree with myself, but I'll throw this out there for you to pick up. Simon Sinek,
yeah,
very well known, very popular, and definitely one of our foremost thought leaders, talks about start with why. And I absolutely agree that the inner burning desire, the motivation, your past experience or upbringing may be a real factor in how you present yourself to the world and what your ambitions and goals are. But I also think that generally, when we turn up for a job interview, it's what can you do and when can you start? Yeah, I don't think we say, what is your internal burning desire? And actually, even with athletes, it starts generally with what and how. And only when we've built the relationship can we gently ask why. Because I think why puts people on the defensive. Why did you do that? You're immediately on the defensive. So I'm really interested in your views on what and how and why, and which of those you use in different circumstances.
Yeah, it's a good point, and lots of thoughts going on around in my head. Just the technical thing about using the words why, what, and how. I've often done examples within coach training where you work in pairs, you get someone to think of something that they'd like to improve, and their partner is only allowed to use the word why at the start of their questions and see what happens. And that quickly turns into a bit of a bun fight, as you say. Feels like, the interrogation spotlight is turned on. It's like, yeah, get off my case. So usually you can ask kind of 3 why questions. And if you ask, more than that, people start talking about, their family or religion. So again, it gets into dangerous territory. So I think grammatically the word why in coaching and management can be quite dangerous. It can be quite powerful, but it can be quite dangerous. So you can soften it by asking a why question with the word what. So, what's the benefit of doing this for us? Or, how, what are we doing this for somehow? So, yeah, softening it, I think, is important, using a what question. Yeah, and then using just how questions takes you to actions too quickly sometimes without wallowing in the reasons for something. And you don't get enough insight. So, I've got a problem with this. Oh, how are you going to fix it? Well, I don't know. I've got a problem with it. I need to let me wallow in the what for a bit. So I think what is a good Swiss Army knife, all-purpose coaching question, and I would recommend it to everyone. So that's the first thing to say. Simon Sinek, actually, in his book, he start with why he actually has an example about a young person going for a job interview. And to your point, I don't know if you obviously you're very aware of his stuff. Remember the bit in the book where this kind of role plays the conversation in the book, and they ask her a question. He says, "Oh, before I answer that question, can I just tell you about my motivations for being it, and she tells the story, or which gives the reason for her motivation and her why, and then she's kind of won them over. So I don't know whether it was a real example, but I think he would say even in those situations where what and how becomes important, going into why does touch us in a different way and enables us to understand somebody, and it's almost like the what and the how kind of melt away, and there's all those quotes from people around, if you have a strong enough why, then you can get through it.
Yeah,
and logotherapy and all that kind of thing. So I don't know. I guess I'm arguing against that. I'm saying that actually, yes, start with why. Before we came on air, I asked you about why I do the podcast, and that's quite useful for me just to understand how to pitch things, or just gives you a sense of someone's motivation. And I think often, talking about governance, that's not done enough in that context as well. So I'm currently the chair of the South Wales County Tennis Committee, and when people joined the committee and when I became the chair, one of my first conversations, the first thing to do was to talk to everyone individually, but one of my first conversations was, what's your motivation? I didn't say why necessarily, but what's your motivation for joining the committee? Isn't that probably the most important thing to know? Why they're there in the first place for them? And maybe you're right. Maybe they're not telling me their real reason, because I need to build a relationship, but hopefully I've shared a bit of my reason why first, and then, role modeled that to them, so that they're more likely to share something with me. I don't know if that answers, but it gives a few thoughts around why.
And it leads me to think about, again, an area which is a bit nebulous. I'm sorry, I'm dumping all of these on you. The sweet spot between certainty and ambiguity. It strikes me that leaders perform really well when they work in really uncertain environments and are able to translate that into tasks, objectives, behaviors that give some people sufficient certainty to know, okay, I now know what I need to do next. But here's the thing. It's never perfect certainty, because when you, particularly for an orator, and you talk about, we live our values, we strive to be the best, you're doing this in such a way that every one of 300 in the audience has a different idea of what be the best actually means. So you're talking in terms that are sufficiently vague that you can have a huge following, but are never sufficiently transparent that they go, oh no, I don't actually agree with that. And I'm quite interested in, and again, as a psychologist, the words that we choose, either intentionally or accidentally, the clarity of our thinking or even direction. It's quite interesting, isn't it? How vague or certain we are on different things. How does that play out in the boardroom? Because we work in a lot of respects in an uncertain world, and we have an audience who want certainty.
Yeah. It's a human need to try and reduce uncertainty and ambiguity. It's quite stressful for us to experience that often. And there's studies which look at people's brain reactions to this, and we don't broadly like that. The cortisol goes up or whatever. So COVID being an example, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress linked to that. And I think it's a role of leaders to reduce that to such an extent that you're able to act. I once heard some great oratory by the head of the SAS at the time, who was doing some work for us, and he always said that leaders were dealers in hope. So within all this ambiguity, you have to create some feeling that there is a next step and there's a direction you can move in. But I think this, again, it's not a straight answer. It's like most things in psychology, isn't it? And but there is probably a sweet spot for different groups of people between amount of certainty and then an amount of ambiguity. And I think good leaders are able to kind of dance around that and work out for people what's appropriate for individuals and for an organization. Because if you just keep on doing the same stuff, you're gonna kind of come unstuck. But if it's too ambiguous and you're changing all the time, then you're not going to move anywhere. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that again, it's a leadership skill, isn't it, to manage that ambiguity for yourself and for others. And some people are better at it than others, I think.
I'd like to pick up on, because we use the word leadership an awful lot.
Yeah.
And we sometimes do it at the expense of the word management. We go, oh, nobody wants to be a manager. You want to be a leader. And I sometimes feel the defender of the manager. I feel, what's wrong with competently getting the task done, looking after your troops, making sure everything goes smoothly, making sure resources are used wisely? What's wrong with being a jolly good caretaker? I mean, farmers are managers of the environment. They don't strive to lead on tree growing. Okay, they are the curators, the custodians. And again, coaches themselves, I don't think would necessarily, and there may be exceptions, but wouldn't see themselves as leader. They're putting their athlete or their client at the forefront, and they're behind the scene. So what for you is the sort of real difference in leadership and management? Because we're very often talking terms that actually date back to Henry Ford and F.W. Taylor. I think leadership and management are different now. How are they for you?
Yeah, it's a big debate, isn't it, in this area? So I really like a guy called Henry Mintzberg, who's a professor from Canada, who doesn't like the idea of leadership either, and he likes the idea of management as a thing, and doesn't necessarily distinguish. I think he doesn't use the word leadership as a. He kind of has it as a swear word in his vocabulary. So I think he just sees different ways of being a manager that do different, that are different functions. And sometimes you're in one function, and that's maybe creating a motivation and a drive for people to do something, and you're articulating a vision of some kind. And sometimes you're cracking on with some more technical things that are highly relevant strategically, but you're just doing some what might be seen more grunt work. I'm very aware. So I delivered some programs for the government of Jersey a few years ago called Inspiring Managers. so a manager can be inspiring, and the accompanying program for leaders at higher or managers at higher grades was called Managers to Leaders. So it was implicit that these are different things, which may or may not be the case. So I think it's good just to have the debate. But I would say that what is it that is useful if you want to be good at supporting people? I think you've got to show certain behaviors, and those are often about vision, support, and challenge. And you kind of need all three of those. So I would go along with some theory, which is transformational leadership theory historically in psychology, which talks about those types of behaviors. So I think if there is a difference, it may be to do with the vision bit. Mm-hmm. So I think a leader in general is someone that's able to articulate and or embody something to aspire to and move forward to. I think managers can do that as well. But if there is something in society that want to distinguish between the two, that's probably the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really interesting. I mean,
but it depends on terms, isn't it? We could talk about terms.
If we look back at Enron, which was a sort of defining case in terms of what is expected of a non-exec, and there were a number of non-execs said, well, I was only the non-exec, I didn't know anything. To which the response was, because you were the non-exec, you were expected to have oversight.
Yep.
And likewise, we see, again, post office scandal, I touched on it once previously earlier. We say, well, I was only the chief exec. I mean, I didn't know, or that's not my area of responsibility, etc. And I think It is interesting what we expect of our leaders in terms of scope and understanding, and where the fine point is. If we say the buck stops here, then we kind of expect you to be accountable. Equally, if you're actually saying I'm not really accountable for all that's done far, far, far below me, why are we paying you $1 million a year? It's a really interesting and complex subject that must play out in the boardroom quite often in terms of responsibility.
Yeah. So it's the distinction between having accountability but not having the knowledge necessarily. And I think that is what leaders should be in that space. But I think if I throw the psychological lens on, if you create the right culture, people will tell you. But often in these environments where they didn't know, or people said they didn't know, it's because people have hid stuff because they don't want to tell the bad news, because they've created a fearful environment, and that's just not news that you share because you're gonna be told off for it. So I think it's probably a cultural thing rather than a standard way of managing or leading. You hear great stories. There was a good story from back in the day, Dave Brailsford, talking about how he shifted the culture in British cycling, specifically around sharing information. And apparently at one point, the mechanic owned the bike. And if you said to the mechanic, "Oh, can you do this?" They're like, "No, I'm doing the bike." And that shifted over time to saying, "Oh, could you just, look at this a little bit more because I'm seeing this?" And like, yeah, and I'll take that on board. You're not blaming them for something. It's just you're working as a team more. So I think it's that shift that means that you can be both accountable and get the knowledge at the same time.
I think the knowledge thing is really interesting. And of course, your background is in tennis, and arguably the entire coaching movement started with Tim Galloway in his book, The Inner Game of Tennis.
Yes.
And it explored the idea that you don't have to be brilliant at tennis to help other people become excellent at tennis. So it is interesting to explore how much knowledge, one might, I saw somebody say around saying, I don't have to have been a horse to become a great jockey. How much we rely on need experience in terms of coaching.
Yeah, that is something I come across all the time whenever I'm working with coaches and training coaches. And I guess it's just about challenging that belief system. How much do you need to know? It doesn't mean that if you know something, you shouldn't say it, but it is entirely possible to not know how to do something yourself to support people. And there's plenty of examples of that. I once interviewed the triple jumper. What's he called? Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards, yeah. I was doing some work for BT and they were sponsoring the Olympics in 2012, and as part of that I got to interview him, and he was talking about the most impactful person, he didn't even call it coach, on his development was a blind physio that used to work with him, just because he was so good at listening and empathizing and asking questions back, and he didn't know anything about triple jump but had a huge impact on his triple jump. So similarly, Adrian Morehouse, my former boss, used to tell the story that he went into the swimming pool once really early, and there was this guy splashing around in the bottom of the pool, and it was his coach, a guy called Terry Dennison, who'd coached him to #1 in the world for 6 years and Olympic gold. It couldn't really swim. So there's some sporting examples definitely, but often find that people who know more and then get promoted to managing that team do a worse job, because then they want to tell people how they did it, and that might not work for people generally. So it's the difference between mentoring and coaching. But I absolutely think you don't need much at all. You might need just to know the rules of the game, and then you can crack on.
It's interesting to draw on from my own experience. We touched on earlier, I used to be a triathlete, or some people would describe me as a wet duathlete because I was awful at swimming. And so I should give credit to both Sally Minty Gravitt and Marcel Morat, who effectively taught me to swim.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting is that because I was truly terrible, I remember Steve Hickson turning around and saying, if there's an award for splashing and emptying the pool, Tim, you'd win it. There's a lot of splashing, not a lot of going forwards. But because I was so awful, I needed a lot of coaching. So I learned lots of techniques. And so for everything that I was getting wrong, I'd have 3 people tell me 5 different ways of improving it. And over the years, I developed a library of coaching tips because I needed them all. And I found it really interesting much later that because I had developed this library that I had relied upon, I now had tips that I could share with other people, which ironically, a really good swimmer may not have ever accumulated that library. And I often think about that, if actually being bad at something may actually make you a better teacher.
Yeah. I think you'd probably have empathy with people starting, and a lot more. There is an issue where there's a phrase for this in psychology. I can't remember at the moment, but it's the inability to see what the beginner's mind is like when you're really good at something. So actually, the best teacher is often the person that's just the next level ahead of you, rather than being the complete expert, because they cannot empathize with what it's like to feel a complete novice. So that maybe that is true from you. And I guess what we're talking about is to what extent you share that tip. When do you share that tip? And I think that's where kind of coaching and mentoring overlaps, that there's probably a bit of understanding who the person is, where they're at, what they need, whether they're going to take on your tip or not. All of that needs to be true before the tip becomes relevant. Maybe quite often what happens is when someone's having a conversation, they share something, but that's a symptom of the thing that they really need the tip on. And I think people quite often just come in and try and solve the symptom rather than understand the actual issue, which the tip would be more relevant to. So I'd encourage everyone just to ask one more probing question to get beyond the symptom before they dive in and try and solve the problem for people.
And how do you find that? Because it is a real skill to avoid jumping to solutions. And indeed, very often, and there are so many schools in terms of coaching, and there are lots of recipes, lots of formulas, lots of approaches, from psychodynamic to ontological, and then you have a fairly structured approach of solution-based coaching with the ICF, which is pretty substantially around the GROW model, which itself came from the inner game of tennis and Tim Galloway. So there's precedent there. But I find it really interesting the extent to which coaching is provoking awareness and helping a person achieve their goal, which is very much driven to a solution, a goal, an outcome. And that coaching, which may be almost existential, it's getting people happy with where they are in life. And maybe there isn't a goal. There's a feeling of belonging, quiet satisfaction. We talk increasingly nowadays about mentalism, meditation, mindfulness, and the like. What are your thoughts on these very different styles of coaching, and where and when do you use either?
Yeah, so a few things popping into my head would be just thinking about motivation. I mean, a kind of very quick kind of background on the science of motivation. For anyone to be motivated, you need the ABC of motivation: autonomy, belonging, competence. We like choice. We like to be with other people. We like to feel like we're doing well at stuff. So that comes from research on self-determination theory. And then more recently, there's a whole other body of research on meaning. It wasn't a D. It was really disappointing not to be a D, but it's an M. So ABC, M, you need motivation to be motivated. And I suppose everything you've just said could fit into that. So what you're trying to do when you're coaching someone is you're getting them to take the responsibility, raising awareness for them, to to kind of solve their own issue, it's a very relational thing. Coaching, it's in a conversation. It feels good because you're in a sense of belonging with someone, and usually it's strengths focused. So you're not just focusing on why you're rubbish. It's okay, well, you're here, but how can you get to here? And that's possible. So there's a competence element, and then wrapped into all that, there might be some meaning. How does all this fit into your life more broadly? So I think all coaching for me can be thought of as about motivation to some large extent. But I think you don't know when you're in a conversation. You don't know someone's sought your help, or you just had something organized, and you don't know what someone needs. So I was in I still do some work for the government of Jersey, and I was in what's called an action learning set. So a group of people, kind of peer coaching, where I'm facilitating their coaching of each other. And we had a session this week, and at the start of the session, somebody throws their issue in, their leadership/management issue, and it may be about trying to solve that issue. It may be that they come up with some actions, but it may be just that they've aired their issue and that they've shared it amongst peers, and that feels better. And sometimes they say, "Oh, I feel like there's a weight off there. It's not just me." And that feeling, that communal sense of sharing, then is enough to then, create some difference somewhere. And often I get people to say, "Okay, well, you've shared some ideas that you've already had. Let's hear from the group. What do they appreciate about what they've heard?" And people ping in some amazingly nice, encouraging comments, and it's just very validating of their competence. And they were going to do this thing, but now they're really going to do this thing, and they're motivated because other people have said that they think it's a good idea as well. So, I think coaching is often thought of as, I'm going to solve this thing with you, and I think ultimately it does, but the way to it, we never really know. Sometimes people just want a bit of confidence. They just want to chat. They just want to cathartically download, but they may want an action plan. I mean, you'd want an action plan, didn't you? That's what you want. Tell me, we're gonna work this through, and I'm gonna crack on. There's no problem about your motivation. So I would tailor things differently for different people.
This has been fascinating, great fun. It's really good to see you again. And it's been really interesting as well, given your psychology, your technical background, to bounce some ideas and understand the mechanics behind that, the why.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed that. And I'd like to, whilst we're on air, bully you into making sure we do another one of these, because this has been really good fun, really interesting, and I think very relevant. I think your experience working with people, boards and teams, and coaching both in a business and in a sporting context is really relevant. We're also aware that you're just republishing your book, so opportunity there for a book plug.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I've written a few. They're essentially on the same topic. One textbook called Boardroom Dynamics, but the book for professionals, if anyone's interested, is published by the Corporate Governance Institute, and it's called The Good Governance Guide to Boardroom Dynamics. So yeah, you said right at the start, what have I learned in the last 10 years? That's probably what's in there. so there's a shortcut to it. A lot of the topics that we've discussed today will be touched on in there. So yeah, no bullying needed. I'd love to re-chat. That'd be great, Tim. Good to catch up.
We'll include obviously a link to that book and your TEDx and anything else that you care to share. Jeremy, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you, Tim.